There's the latest headlines. Here's Hard Talk.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. Mental illness is the invisible scourge of modern life, and it comes with a stigma. To admit to depression or any other illness of the mind has been to risk being labelled as weak, self-indulgent, or mad. My guest today wants to change that. Ruby Wax made her name as a comedian and TV entertainer. Long experience of depression eventually took her into neuroscience and psychotherapy. Mental illness raises difficult questions. Where did she find the answers? Ruby Wax, welcome to Hard Talk. You have made one heck of a career shift from TV star to student of the brain and neuroscience. Does amusing and entertaining people no longer matter to you?
Well, I'm still entertaining them, but now I'm talking about the brain. Because I think people now crave information, and what could be more interesting than the 3-pound size of a McDonald's, can I say that? That's sitting on top of your head. Brian Cox can study the stars, but there's nothing more fascinating. But now I take it on tour, and it's TED Talk squared. Explain the journey, but I'm funny. I have to say it because nobody else is here.
So your mission, if I can put it that way, is to try to explain to people how the brain works and how that can be linked to issues of mental illness, but do it in an entertaining way.
No, I had a show that was more about mental illness, which I've toured for the last 7 years to various countries, and that was a little bit about mental illness. This new one is really about everybody's brain, because, should I tell you how that started?
Well, go on.
The other one. The other show started because Comic Relief said, could they take a photo of me, because they were giving some money to the charity of mental illness. I thought it was going to be small, but it ended up a gigantic poster of me everywhere that said, "This woman has mental illness, please help her." So I was mortified, and I thought, well, I'll write a show and make that look like it's my publicity poster.
So you at that time, we're going back a few years now to this charity money-raising campaign, you literally became the sort of poster woman
girl
for
mental illness.
For mental illness.
Yeah.
But I mean, you were mentally ill. Let's get that out on the table right now. You suffered all of your life from sometimes very severe depression.
Yes, but the thing about depression, and probably why it has a stigma, is you don't have it all the time. So this is why people think, well, if it comes and goes, come on, perk up. You can pull out of it. It is an episodic illness. So luckily, I wasn't working when I had it, because that would be impossible. And people say to me, does it have anything to do with working in show business? I go, read my lips, 1 in 4. That's Mrs. Somalia, that's somebody in a mud hut, that's around the world. And again, it isn't about sadness, it's about a deadness. It's no movement, it's no feeling, it's like being filled with cement, so to move an arm would be impossible. It's a disease of the brain.
You have talked about and there's a great phrase, the dead shark eyes that you see in people who have depression. Do you really think you can look at people, you can look at me or anybody else you meet, and know pretty much for sure whether they are suffering from depression?
Oh, completely. That's why when I'm together with my people, because we can see it, we don't have to endlessly say, I'm fine. When somebody asks you how you are, we know we're in the dark side. So
that's how you feel about people who share this affliction.
Oh,
There's
it's
a
so
sort of
warming, because you don't have
feel.
you don't have to explain endlessly about why it's so difficult to get up. They know. And I think teachers should have photographs of eyes that look depressed somewhere in their office, so that when they spot it in a child, they know this isn't sad and it's not puberty. This is an illness, and to get them help pretty quickish.
Before we get, and you've got quite a number of ideas about how the public can better deal with mental illness and with depression in particular. But before we get into that, I want to take you back, because it seems to me what you have done by writing about it extensively in memoirs and a book that is specifically about the workings of the brain, what you've done is examine yourself very closely. And I wonder, when you now look at your own life from beginning to now, do you feel you understand yourself pretty completely?
Well, this is what neuroscience is. There is no self. You know, all the therapy you want. We're not like a plane crash when there's a black box and that's you. There are many selves, and everything is constantly changing, which again is something I'd like the public to know, because you certainly learn it at university. It's what I studied at Oxford, that this little mass is constantly changing, and we aren't really slaves to our genes. So the fact that I went to Oxford and I didn't even graduate nursery school is more proof of neuroplasticity than I can ever put. I wasn't a bright kid, but when you get older and you get curious, it's about curiosity rather than saying, oh, this is what I am. We love to label ourselves. I'm a victim, I'm a loser, we aren't. Everything really is possible. You grow more, you know, a forest of information.
That sort of idea of the brain as Play-Doh that can be reshaped and molded is a powerful one. And you've stressed that ability to change, and you say that, you know, we are not slaves to our genes, but are we to some extent slaves to our upbringing, to our environment, and particularly to the way in those very early years our parents raise us? I ask that because of your own upbringing.
I happen to have the A-list of madness. I mean, you can't top my parents. This is the Oscar winners. But if
why? I mean, you need to explain.
Oh, Viennese, hysterical, bringing, you know, the war with them to bring into our kitchen. My mother spoke like this. Civilized people don't bring sand in the building. You know, this was the voice. She wanted me to take a shower outside the house.
To be clear, she and your father escaped just before the Nazis really took over Austria.
Yeah.
And they came to the Midwest of the United States. You were a Midwestern girl, but you were living with parents who, as you describe
never mentioned what went on. That's the thing. So I couldn't understand why they were playing mental volleyball with me. So if they had explained it a little bit. Now, you can say people are traumatized from the war, but they weren't really, they got out early. And I've met people from the Holocaust, they say, listen, you pretty much, if you're sane before you go and you aren't traumatized, that will reflect in your personality after the war. But to have both parents, you know, we used to call them the Scud missiles because they'd shoot over from America. I tried most of my life to get into Europe, and it's funny, my parents tried to get out. So,
but because of the maybe the fearfulness they felt throughout their lives because of what they knew of what they'd escaped, and the loss of their community and their homeland, did that fearfulness mean that you never really felt their approval or their affection or their love? Well,
it could be that they were very jealous because I was the child of the 60s. So imagine you're totally persecuted, and then the party starts. So I can imagine, and my mother was very beautiful, so she lost her heyday. She was running. So I can imagine they were quite envious. And I forgive them, for God's sake. I now know they were mentally ill. And of course, in those days, there was no label. They'd say, your mother's having a change of life. And I said, for 87 years?
But that is so important to, in a sense, my understanding of you. You say that you now accept, and your parents were mentally ill. Did they make you mentally ill? Well,
if you don't have the gene, if it's not expressed, you can have parents that are hanging from the trees, you won't get it. But if you do have that gene lurking, I am making it simple, and then there's an abusive parental upbringing, I would say bingo, chances are big that something will happen. Now, trauma is something else, but depression certainly happens when it's a combination of upbringing and nurture nature.
So you were a child in the US who, for many years, I think was pretty insecure, quite shy, didn't have a whole lot of friends, and yet something clicked with you. You found a way of reaching out to people and becoming popular, and it seemed to revolve around making people laugh and comedy.
Yeah. That's a safety net, I'll tell you, because I always think with my background I would have either ended up a comedian or a serial killer. There wasn't a chance, but because I found this way of expressing myself, I could relieve the poison and also entertain people. Because if you whine, I'm this, people turn away. If you're funny, everything's acceptable. I think that's why I could do a show about mental illness. And I did it for people in institutions, and they accepted it because I was honest about mine, and they knew I was one of them.
Now, I want to get to the reaching out to people who have mental illness in a moment, but I'm just fascinated by this career that you got into and made a huge success of, which was about comedy. You did some stand-up, you were in sitcoms, you then became a major sort of TV star doing interviews, funnily enough, which were amusing and entertaining.
You create a persona because it's so, you know, your first one is so, doesn't have a chance, especially if the parents always say, yeah, you're a sad sack, or yeah, who's going to marry you? Look at you, your behind is as big as a house. So these voices were in sometimes, either you go under or you put that throttle in, you know, into first gear, and to prove everybody wrong. You know, my life was an act of revenge. You become I had the drive of a Rottweiler, so, which is great, but it also means you can crash into a wall.
Right.
Because none of us know our tipping point.
Would you have been a success if you had been a happier person?
There's comedians, I can name some, that are perfectly normal backgrounds because it has to do with the rhythm. It's like, why is somebody a mathematician? You know, comedy is about hearing jazz rather than a steady beat.
Right, so you don't have to be unhappy to be a good comedian.
No, it has to do with rhythm. No, you don't have to be unhappy.
Right, but you were unhappy at times. Not, as you say, you could work
at 16,
when you weren't depressed.
At 16, I knew how to, I wasn't going to be prom queen, but I knew that comedy was my route in. So I could get all the attractive boys just by this area. I didn't have to have this thing going on. So that was my seduction. And then it worked when I came to England. I mean, I was a pathetic actress, but I was funny. That's
you were funny
ticket.
when you weren't feeling low.
Listen, with depression, when you feel low, you're low. You're over and out. You're in a full coma. When you're okay, you're however you are. You
were a driven person. You've already said that. You called yourself a Rottweiler. I mean, you've written things that suggest you weren't a very nice person at the height of your success. I mean, you've written things like, for example, whatever your success, you said, if I see someone with more than I have, I get that kick in the stomach, that stab in the heart. Envy, career insecurity,
envy.
Massive desire to be better and get more than the other guy. Was that driving
we
you?
live in this kind of society. Because magazines have it in our, hold these images, we live with a disease called entitlement. So now everybody thinks they have a shot. This is why you get people on X Factor with the talent of a toothpick, and girls, with their long fingernails, they don't know they're the size of Tibet. Everybody wants a shot at it. I don't think it was any different for me. And everybody goes for show business for some reason because your narcissism is fed and you get a lot of money. So I didn't have more than anybody else.
What pushed you over the edge? Because there came a point, you'd been in the Priory and rehab.
Over the edge as far as mental illness?
Well, no, as far as deciding to yourself, you know what, this career of mine, although I've had great success, it is now actually doing me great damage. I have got to stop trying to entertain people, trying to make them laugh and be the joker. And I need to reassess, and what you decided to do was go to university and take the study of the brain very seriously.
Yeah.
That's a heck of a decision. I'm trying to see what made you change.
First of all, I wanted to leave the party before the party left me. There's nothing more tragic than somebody in show business who's so addicted that they cling on for dear life, and say, please make a documentary about my gallbladder operation. I'm begging you.
But you did for a while. I mean, I don't want to go through difficult stuff with you, but you did for a while. You did a show called Celebrity Shark Bait, which is possibly one of the most inane shows I've ever heard of.
That was my farewell to show business. You have to go that low before you can get off the heroin of being on television.
Seriously, when they put you in a cage
with sharks,
but
with Richard E. Grant, let's be fair.
Well, even with Richard E. Grant, I'm struggling to see how that could be much fun.
No, it was humiliating. That's what some people don't mind eating bugs or showing their insides inside of a house. To me, that's when I knew this was going to happen, or I had to change career.
This is important. Why on earth did Ruby Wax say yes to celebrity shark bait?
Because by then I was so addicted to being famous. You know, it becomes an addiction. You don't have to even do anything for a living. You say one line and people go, oh, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a little lie down? It's addictive because you're infantilized. You're very, you know, so you haven't got the muscle even to do a job.
You say it was the lowest of the low.
No, that's not why I left. At a certain age, you better jump to the next invention of yourself. Unfortunately, we live so long. You know, it just goes on and on and on. You know,
Right.
I should have been dead by now. You have to do something else to keep the brain going.
You consciously thought you're going to
I'm not going to be a stereotype.
change and you're going to reinvent yourself.
And I'm going to get smart, because when I was young, because of the trauma, I couldn't remember things. So I didn't really read. I was terrible in school, because when you live with that kind of stress, the first thing to go is the memory. By the way, teachers should know that when they push their kids for exam, the first thing that goes down is the memory. So this was a chance. I now knew I was kind of liberated, that I could go back and fill that void and suddenly become academic.
You did, and reading your book, Sane New World, which actually, interestingly, is quite a lot of science, and you go into some detail about the way the brain works, the circuitry, the key chemicals.
But it's funny.
Well, it's funny because
it's true.
It's very personal,
Yeah.
but it also informs about the way the brain works. Coming back to this idea of the plasticity, the flexibility of the brain, you seem to be saying that we all have the capacity to rewire ourselves, to change the way our brain works. I think a lot of people will be puzzled about how we could do that.
Well, it's very difficult unless you put it in kind of simple, kind of stick
Be as
figures.
simple as you like, because that works for me.
They do know now, there's something called epigenetics, that they do know that you come into the world, you're not hardwired, you don't have to necessarily go out the way you came in, that your experience and how you think about life actually changes, first of all, the neural connections, which actually are who we are. You know, if I do something over and over again, my neurons connect. And so if I don't consciously change that, I'm at the mercy of every time this happens, I react that way. Some women say, all men are bastards, I'm always a victim. And you think, well, yes, sweetheart, you went on the serial killer website. What do you think is going to happen? We have to get to see how stuck we are. Once you're conscious.
So you change behaviors.
By becoming aware, by watching how you think, not making a judgment, and leaving a little gap before you do your usual your usual trigger or your usual reaction. You start to watch it a little bit, and so it gives you a chance to unwire those heavy habits,
right.
And
I think
create
I'm
new
getting
ones.
this. So you're saying that by being very conscious of the way you respond to challenges, the way you apply
Without
your
giving
thinking,
yourself a hard
you
time.
can actually physically change the circuitry in the brain. What's interesting about that is that it would suggest that your approach to depression, and people around the world who are watching this who may suffer from depression will be interested in this, you seem to be saying your approach is much more behavioral and changing the way you see things and think about things than it is about drugs. Did you
I am on
yourself
drugs, yeah.
never use drugs?
Of course, I'm on antidepressants.
You are?
Yeah, of course. I haven't, it's like say you had a diabetic here and saying, are you kidding, you're on insulin? You know, again, it's a disease of the brain. If you had Alzheimer's, also a disease, you wouldn't say to me, come on, you can remember what happened yesterday. So you can't even do cognitive therapy, mindfulness therapy, if you're in a depressed state. And when people say exercise, that's ridiculous. You're in a box, you can't move. Now, when I'm better, I wanted to find something preventative.
So the drugs and the therapies are knitted, they work together.
They work together. And look, drugs don't work for everybody. Therapy doesn't work for everybody. I'm putting all my eggs not in one basket. Something's going to work.
Here's a personal question. You described the degree to which your parents, in particular your mother, did a lot to shape your early mental development. You've got kids of your own. How have you used what you now know about the brain and the mind to try to shape your kids in the best way?
I can feel the urges that maybe were past that my mother or father, which is quite aggressive, which is, I feel myself even wanting to strike them, and the words that they used to say, how dare you, you know what I've given you. I can feel it, but because I understand that isn't really me, it's a habit. It worked probably in my past because my aggression, again, made me knock down doors. But when I feel that urge, I don't act on it. Thoughts aren't facts. I realize it's a trait. But if I pull myself back and actually be kind to myself and say, Ruby, that's just that's just a tape recording. You can't whip yourself because then you're stressed about stress.
Do you think you've been a good mother?
I made sure that my kids never saw me when they were young, when I was seriously depressed. I didn't want them frightened. So my husband would sort of say, Mommy's on a holiday or she's making a documentary. I was lucky. Then when they were 16, we allowed them to come into the institution. They could see, well, there were other people that were really remarkably interesting. So they didn't have a fear of it.
There are people who listen to you and your sort of missionary efforts to get people to understand depression and
the brain
illness better, and the brain, because, for all of our brains.
Yeah, because all of us are suffering now.
I understand that message.
Yeah, all of us
this isn't just about people who are acknowledged mentally ill. It's about all of us who, in one way or another, have issues with the way
voices, negative voices.
I get that.
The frenzy that we can't find any breaks. Yeah.
Your belief that depression is such a pervasive thing that so many of us have to deal with. 1 in 4, you say. That has actually frustrated and annoyed some people. I mean, there's the well-known British journalist Janet Street Porter. I don't know if you've...
I know Janet, yeah.
I don't know if you've discussed this with her generally, but not so long ago, she wrote a very powerful piece. It wasn't directed at you personally, but she said basically she's sick of the misery movement. She said, think about how many of these new high-profile sort of sufferers from mental illness are middle class, highly successful, most important of all, she says, comfortably off. There's something slightly repellent about this epidemic of middle-class breastbeating.
By saying that, do you know the highest suicide is for young men under 30? By putting even more shame on top of this. And she's from Yorkshire. Tell her to knock on somebody's door. It'll be their mother or their cousin. Are they breastfeeding and complaining? They're not even coming out of their house because somebody put shame like that on it. Highest suicide rates ever. Kids who are cutting themselves. This isn't my imagination.
We've got to close in a second, and I just want to bring it back to you personally. You've spent so many years now thinking about the brain and about the way our minds work and about how to try to repair minds that aren't functioning well. What about yourself? After all this talk of living in the moment, the mindfulness that you try and keep, are you really at peace with yourself now? No, I'm not. There is no bliss. There is no phone call from Oprah. This doesn't exist. That's a fantasy. You can't get to a point where you say, I have left my mental illness behind. Your mind will never be empty. When it's empty, you're dead. There's all these fallacies about being in the present. You're not always supposed to be in the present. You'd be a head of lettuce. It means that you, with all this incoming bad news everywhere, with this needing to be, as twerking as well as Miley Cyrus, being beautiful, there's an onslaught, we can find our own breaks. We don't stay in that break, but we have to know where's our tipping point. I can't be Bill Gates, okay? I'm not going to kill myself for it. We have to say, this is where I have to rest. Now, when you rest, it means you've got more energy to go back in again. A kid shouldn't be up all night studying. He should pull it back 20 minutes. 20 minutes, just sit there, eat something, but taste it. Listen to music, but listen to it. Just hook in with what's going on now. Otherwise, you miss the journey. I know that's cliche. And I hope we eventually go to survival of the wisest rather than survival of the fittest. That's a nice thought to end on. Ruby Wax, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk. Thank you very much.